The Souls games have some of the most difficult bosses ever developed in gaming history, and amongst the From Software lineup, there are a select few in the games that stand above the rest in terms of difficulty by a mile. They are the most difficult and challenging bosses you will ever encounter. And so with the new Elden Ring DLC, Shadow of the Erdtree bosses included, we're ranking the top 20 most difficult bosses in all of Souls games. Technically for this list, I considered everything from Demon Souls to Elden Ring. However, I will say I opted out for including anything from Sekiro because I feel like those bosses are very different in a way and would end up dominating a lot of this list. So for the sake of keeping it to a more traditional Souls boss list and letting some of these shine, coming in at number 20 is going to be Manus, Father of the Abyss from Dark Souls 1. This is in the DLC of this game, and one thing you're going to notice is that typically the hardest bosses of a particular game are going to be found in the DLC, and that's not always the case, but that tends to be what happens, and so Manus is no exception to that. And I would say for the time, this was probably looked at as one of the most difficult boss fights in gaming. You can look at Manus now and be like, okay, well, honestly, it's kind of a slow-paced fight. If you learn the moves and know what you're doing, it's not too bad. And I would agree with that. In modern day, I don't think Manus is the hardest fight in, everything that we could be playing, but at the time, I think it was a very big challenge, and this was also a pretty new archetype of a fight for From Software. I think this caught a lot of players by surprise because this is a big demon that not only has insane damage up close, but can still hit you at range with some of his moves, and I think that makes him a very scary foe to fight against. Not to mention, I also personally feel like his moves are strange because his animations are not, they don't look very natural, and for better or for worse for the fight, that's up to you, but I feel like his movement is so odd, and that can definitely throw me off. It makes him look sick, like for sure. He looks otherworldly, which is, kind of the point, but I think this fight has a little room for improvement. I think in modern day, this could work a lot better, and again, he's not the most difficult fight by modern standards, but it's nice and fun, and I think for being the finale of Dark Souls 1, it did exactly what it needed to do, ended it off with a bang, and Manus is a very memorable boss no matter which way you look at it, and he's pretty tough as well. Coming in at number 19 is Dark Lurker from Dark Souls 2. This is like a crazy pick. Like, I know this is kind of out of pocket, but I'm not gonna lie, I think Dark Lurker maybe gave me some of the most trouble that I had with this game, and on paper it really shouldn't. The craziest aspect to this whole fight is not really the boss itself. I mean, kind of, but not really. In order to get back into the arena, you have to consume a finite item, which I cannot think of any other boss that forces you to burn, limited items in order to get back into the arena. That's never been the case, but they made it here, and, that's annoying enough, but also, I would say Dark Lurker is a fairly tough foe no matter what. At some point in the fight, about the halfway mark, he's gonna split and mirror, and you actually have to fight two of them at once. They're just gonna be throwing out roughly the same moves, and you need to deal with essentially both of them. He's got a wide variety of magic attacks. I think this boss looks visually stunning. Like, I love the design of it, but the arena's so boring. It's just like this random cave, I feel like if this had a cooler arena to complement it, I would enjoy this fight a lot more. I do still think it's one of the hardest fights in Souls, though, to be honest. Like, go play Dark Lurker again and see what you think about it, but I think it's a pretty tough one, especially for Dark Souls 2 standards, because I don't think that game has the hardest bosses in the world personally, but I think, all things considered, this has to be one of them, if anything. But anyways, moving on, coming in at number 18, we're heading back to Dark Souls 1, and this is going to be Knight Artorius. It's one of my personal favorites, even though I don't think it's the hardest boss in Souls. I feel like at the time, Artorius could have been looked at as the face of the DLC and the most difficult boss in that pack, and I would probably tend to agree. I think Artorius is one of those fights that really brings DS1 to its limits. Obviously, Dark Souls in the past was a much more slow-paced and deliberate game, and so the breakneck pace of combat speed that we're used to now just really didn't translate back then. However, Artorius, basically took Dark Souls 1 to its absolute limit when it comes to combat speed. I think this was really proof of concept and became the blueprint for a lot of the best bosses in Souls history, and this was certainly very difficult for the time, and especially in the, slower, you could argue more clunky Dark Souls 1 combat system. Artorius still complements the combat system, I think, anyways, and as far as the boss himself, he's just a knight with a sword, and, he's very aggressive. Not to mention, he has tons of crazy mix-ups, and he can also buff himself through the fight. Once he starts to get to low health, he will back off and then buff himself with, like, abyss magic, and this makes him a damage machine. You will probably die if you don't prevent him from buffing. Like, if you deal enough damage, you can stop his charge, basically, but it's very risky, and if you don't manage to do it, you're probably dead. So you still have to be aggressive in the face of, you know, an equally aggressive knight, which was pretty different for, you know, what Dark Souls demanded of you at that time. But I love him, one of my favorite bosses in the entire franchise, and certainly a challenge for the age that it came out in. Moving on to number 17, we're heading back to Dark Souls 2, and this is one of the most difficult fights in the DLC of that game, and this is the Fum Knight. So one of the strange things about this boss is that in order to actually fight this, there are a bunch of these kind of like crystal items around his arena that you need to use like other consumables to break, otherwise he has an infinitely regenerating health pool. You literally can't kill him if you don't deal with these first, and so that's probably additive to his perceived difficulty. But even when destroying all of these crystals so that he cannot heal throughout the fight, he's still no walk in the park. I would say he plays very similar to Artorius in terms of how aggressive he is, but he has one small sword and one giant colossal sword, leading to pretty cool mix-ups and, you know, very delayed moves. And you can look at Fum Knight now and be like, nah, he looks slow and boring and honestly pretty easy, but you have to consider the context of the game that it's in. Not only is Dark Souls 2's combat and movement just very slow and clunky, but the game is hella jank too, and so you're probably going to get hit by stuff, and the boss is going to feel a lot harder just because the game isn't of the highest quality, to be honest. Like, I'm just going to say it, if you're playing, you know, Dark Souls 2 in modern day, that's kind of your fault. I personally don't feel like Dark Souls 2 has the hardest boss lineup. It has the most bosses of any Souls games, but most of them aren't very difficult. The Fum Knight is an exception, I think, and so that's why he made this list. So coming in at number 16 is Soul of Cinder from Dark Souls 3. This is the final boss in the base game, you know, nothing including the DLC. This is our first Dark Souls 3 boss and your final battle if you don't play the DLC, and I think he's great. He is an amalgamation of all of the Lords of Cinder before him, so he's got a mix of Gwyn, he's got a mix of tons of other bosses that you'll encounter in DS3. Now his moveset is very unique, to say the least. I mean, he can do just about everything in the game. He's got tons of melee capability, he has amazing, you know, magic damage and output as well. He can passively heal, he can do all this stuff. He even has a second phase, which he really goes crazy in. He's got just about every mechanic that you've learned in Dark Souls 3 up to this point, and I think that's kind of how you make an amazing final boss. Now, again, he's not the hardest final boss we've ever fought, but he's certainly one of them, and I would also say he's probably one of the hardest bosses in vanilla DS3, and you would hope that would be the case as he is the final fight if you don't play the DLC. But I think, again, for the time, Dark Souls was getting a little more advanced and a little more modern, and I think this really works for this game's flow and combat specifically. I think Soul of Cinder is absolutely fantastic, and it's one of my personal favorites, although I don't think it's the hardest boss we've ever seen in the world. Coming in at number 15 is going to be Sister Freda from the Dark Souls 3 DLC Ashes of Ariandel, and this fight's crazy, bro. Like, it's one of the most unique structures of any Souls fight, period. You have 3 separate phases, which are all distinct. You have to fight Sister Freda by herself in this small hallway where she kind of turns invisible and strikes you with her scythe. It's not too bad. Once you pass that, then you have to fight both Father Ariandel and Freda at the same time, and then, even after defeating both of them, you then need to fight her final form as Black Flame Freda, and it becomes absolutely a fast-paced nightmare at that point. And look, here's the thing, really, I mean, the individual phases aren't that bad on their own. You know, if you look at these as individual segments, they're not too hard of a fight. Sure, they're a fair challenge, but they're not, like, insane. However, the difficult part is that it's a resource marathon. You have to do all 3 phases without dying, so if you die on the Black Flame Freda part, you gotta go all the way back to the beginning and then do it all over again. It's a long one, and that's where the challenge is. That's the difficult part. You know, Freda on her own in phase 1, piece of cake. In phase 2, you can deal damage to both of them, and, you know, as long as you can manage 2 enemies at the same time, not too bad. Black Flame Freda, pretty challenging and fast-paced, but, you know, by that point, you're probably stripped of all your Estus, and you may be running low, and I think I know a lot of people struggle on this fight, and I think it's for good reason, because it's way longer than anything we've really faced before. Coming up at number 14 is our first Elden Ring boss of the list so far. This is Godfrey, First Elden Lord. This is who you encounter just before the final boss fight of the base game, and in my opinion, I feel like this one is definitely more of a challenge. Radagon and Elden Beast are a difficult fight, sure, but I think for, you you know, the kind of the marathon reasons that Sister Freda has. It's just a long fight, and I would say that Godfrey's fight isn't as long, but it's more intense in my opinion. Now, he does have two phases. In phase 1, he's just Elden Lord with the axe. He's got many aggressive moves and a lot of fast-paced mix-ups up close. If you try to back away from Godfrey, you're most likely going to die because he will chase you down. The trick to this fight is staying right in front of him and dodging each move respectively if you can. It's tough to do, obviously, but it's certainly learnable. I think this is one of the most fun fights to learn. It also includes a lot of jump defense. You know, jumping is a mechanic that you can use in Elden Ring to dodge a lot of moves, and I feel like Godfrey is the one that takes advantage of this mechanic the most, which is pretty cool. Once you get him to about 45% health or so, he will enter phase 2, in which he becomes Horaloo. He essentially transforms into a totally different person. He loses the axe, the big lion's gone, and he just runs you down. This is all melee hand-to-hand combat. He's got a lot of grab moves that will, you know, instantly pick you up and deal tons of damage, or big ground slams that cover almost the entire arena, so that's something to be careful about as well. He does implement a lot of moves that require jump defense and stuff like that, which again is fun. I think this is one of the most unique fights in Elden Ring, and even if it's not the most challenging fight, it's certainly one of them, and I think deserves to be on this list. All right, lads, coming in at number 13, you know we had to do it to him. This is Dark Eater Madar from the Dark Souls 3 DLC. This one's hard, man. I'm not gonna lie. I feel like this is one of the most challenging fights in that whole game, and still resonates in the Soul series even to this day. I still think it's easily the most difficult dragon fight other than the other one on this list, which I won't reveal yet, but we'll get there. Madar is basically the perfection and the blueprint of all dragon fights. This is how they should be done, and I think, you know, Dark Souls tried to figure out dragon fights, and they struggled a little bit in DS 1 and 2. I didn't love those ones, but they were proof of concept. One of the main problems with big dragon fights in Souls games has always been the fact that they really just don't play nice with the camera, almost ever. Madar is the exception to that rule, and I would also say he's better, and I would even argue harder than Placidusax. That's not the other dragon that I'm referring to, and he's not on this list. I think Madar is technically more difficult than that fight, and especially given, you know, the tool set you have in Dark Souls 3, I think this fight is very hard because he has an astronomically large health bar. It's insane. Like, even some of the strongest builds in the game don't do nearly enough damage to, you know, really chunk at his health away. It's going to be a long fight regardless, and, you know, if your build's not optimized, you might find that you're doing almost no damage to him, or it appears that way because his health bar is just so insane. Madar is super fun though, and I think I may even have put him a little higher on this list if it wasn't so competitive with all of these other ones, but we got to move on. Coming in at number 12, we have Laurian and Lothric. This is in the base game of Dark Souls 3, actually, and this is who you fight just before Soul of Cinder. I feel like this is kind of the Godfrey equivalent to, you know, Radagon and Elden Beast of this game. I think this fight's more fun, and I think it's more of a challenge. So what is it that makes this fight particularly challenging? Once you begin the fight, you're only going to be fighting one enemy. That's Laurian, the older brother, and he is a very aggressive sword user. Now, the thing is, he can teleport with magic and slightly change his positioning, and that might not sound like a big deal, but depending on your build and perhaps your personal playstyle, getting your flow slightly disrupted, that can mean life or death. And he has this crazy, uncanny ability to ever so slightly delay what he's doing to kind of make you readjust your rhythm. And if you can't adapt to that, then you may end up really struggling in this fight. But, you know, fighting Laurian, you know, one-on-one is challenging enough, but if you can deal with him for long and take him down, then Lothric joins the fight, jumps on his back, and he can infinitely revive Laurian if you don't kill him. So what you have to do is be smart about what, like, whiff punish windows you take and where your positioning is, because you want to be dealing damage to Lothric first and foremost. Otherwise, you know, all of your damage that you do deal is going to be for naught. He's just going to pick him back up once again. And I think that, you know, on top of Lothric throwing kinds of all this magic and still having to dodge melee attacks from Laurian, the older brother, this fight is just fantastic all around. It really complements the combat of Dark Souls 3. I think it's one of FromSoftware's best designed bosses ever, just from a, you know, purely mechanical standpoint, and it's so fun, and I think it's a very good challenge. I would love to see a fight like this make its way into a slightly more modern FromSoft game, but, you know, in my opinion, I still won't back down. I think it's a very challenging fight and deserves to be on this list nonetheless. Moving on to number 11 is Mohg, Lord of Blood from Elden Ring. Now, this is specifically the Lord of Blood version, if that wasn't obvious, because there is another version of Mohg in the game who is not nearly as challenging, who is located, you know, under the Leyndell sewers, but he's not nearly as hard as this guy. What makes Lord of Blood very different is a couple of things. Number 1 is Blood Boon Ritual. This is a move that he's going to use that you essentially need to use a physic tier in order to completely nullify. Otherwise, you're going to lose tons of health no matter what. It's unavoidable if you don't have this tier. The other thing that's very difficult is that he has a phase 2, and I personally feel like this is one of the hardest phase switch ups of all time. He gets wings, he can actually fly around, move a lot quicker, he's dealing more damage, he can basically lather the entire arena in blood flame, and that's very difficult to deal with, and he's just an overall super aggressive enemy with a pretty big health pool. He's also the gatekeeper to the DLC of this game, so if you want to access Shadow of the Erdtree, you have to defeat Mohg. Like, literally, that's how you have to get in. Now, there's ways to cheese him, obviously, but if you're playing him in a straight fair fight and you haven't punched at least 6 holes in your wall, then you're not in deep enough, honestly. Skill issue. Coming in at number 10 is the boss that had the entire world in a chokehold, and if you're just looking at completion stats, the Nameless King is technically the most difficult boss in Dark Souls 3. You could say that's maybe because it's in a difficult area of the game to reach. It's actually a secret boss, but this is what was revered as the hardest boss in the entire game for a very long time, maybe not including the DLC, but I think the Nameless King really does still live up to its name. It's this unknown guy. It's like, where did he come from? Is this a descendant of Gwyn? Why is he friends with dragons? We don't know. And the other thing is, I feel like the Nameless King kind of, reflects his moveset as well. I think the reason he's perceived as difficult is not only do you have to defeat his flying drake first and foremost in the beginning phase, but then when you fight just him, I don't think that there's a whole lot of From Software bosses that have as deep of a moveset and as many mix-ups as this guy does. I feel like I see something new every single time I play against him, and I know that there is a limited range of moves, but I just feel like there's something new every time I play him, which is not the case for a lot of bosses, or almost any of them. Once you download their moveset, you kind of know what it is, but Nameless King still manages to surprise me every time that I fight him. And even now, in 2024, Dark Souls 3 is almost 10 years old, but I still feel like Nameless King is difficult enough and holds up well enough to crack into the top 10 of the hardest bosses in Souls ever, for sure. Coming in at number 9, we have the Beast Clergyman, otherwise Malekith the Black Blade. This is a hard fight, and I would argue probably one of the most difficult fights in base game Elden Ring, maybe even more so than Mohg. And so, phase 1, fighting against the Beast Clergyman isn't too difficult. He's extremely aggressive and has lots of, quick projectiles that you need to respond to quickly. Phase 1 is not the problem here, though. If this was the only version of the boss, this would be quick and easy. I think it'd be very forgettable, and most people wouldn't even talk about this fight. It's phase 2, in which he actually gets the Blade of Death, that this becomes something else entirely. Once he becomes Malekith, his moveset is very acrobatic. He's up in the air a lot, he's flipping around, he's throwing projectiles at you, and he's not vulnerable for too long. You really gotta optimize and pick and choose your punish windows, otherwise you're not gonna be dealing a whole lot of damage to him, and his Destined Death move will actually continuously drain your health, and it will temporarily cap the amount of maximum HP that you can recover, which is a big problem. Essentially just shortens your health bar. I would say this boss is so tough that there's an item in the game that's meant to make this fight a little bit easier. When he comes in for his Destined Death swings, there's an item that essentially allows you to parry them and get big punish windows, but if you're not using that item, then good luck, because it's a tough one. I will say, after a lot of experience, I've been playing against Malekith for a long time, and it's certainly gotten easier. Once you learn what he can do, it's not too difficult, because he doesn't have the largest moveset. He's got devastating moves, sure, but he doesn't have a ton of mix-ups, and if you can figure him out pretty quickly, you can deal with him, but it takes a lot of practice. Luckily, another thing to mention is you can kind of use the pillars in the arena to your advantage, either to block projectiles that he's throwing at you, or, to kind of make some space in between you guys. There's things you could do to manipulate the fight in your favor, obviously, but I think Destined Death specifically, getting hit by that move can pretty much mean, the end of your game. Even if you're playing really well, getting hit by that once can definitely turn the tide, but I love Malekith. Great fight and very difficult as well. Coming up next, guys, at number 8, we have Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower in the Bloodborne DLC. She is an extremely tough fight and is essentially your final gatekeeper before the last boss in this expansion pack, but she's tough on her own, and she's also one of my favorite fights in this entire game, just because I love the way that it complements Bloodborne's combat so perfectly. You get to utilize every single function to the fullest extent here, and it's one of the most enjoyable fights. Lady Maria, she's really a skill check for all of the fundamentals that Bloodborne was teaching you about its mechanics, and you get to put them all on full display here. Medear. Now, as far as her actual boss, fight goes, she has 3 different phases, but they're kind of like soft phases. In phase 1, she's just using her typical swords, nothing really too crazy going on. Once you get her to about half health, she is going to start using blood magic, and then once you get her to phase 3, which is about like 20% health or so, then she starts using like blood and flames, and that is when she's dealing the most damage. Her moves are insane at this point, and she fights very fast. However, you can read and respond to her moves in any phase. This boss is entirely about reactions, and I love that. It's like if you're reacting and responding to everything perfectly, picking the right option in a split second is way tougher than it sounds, but if you manage to do it, then you get heavily rewarded in this fight. So much so that sometimes I almost feel like she should have more health. If you play this almost perfectly, the fight's over before you know it, and I kind of wish that she maybe or entered her other second and third phases slightly earlier, because those are the coolest parts of the fight, but you don't really get to enjoy it as much if you're playing, like an absolute maniac. But she's fantastic. This is a tremendous boss fight and is very memorable for the Bloodborne DLC. She is literally amazing. All right, fellas, coming in at number 7, I hinted at him earlier. I said Medear is the hardest dragon fight in all of Souls except one, and that, fellas, is going to be Bale the Dread. I think that he is easily more difficult than both Medear and also Placidusax. That's the only other one that I would consider for this, and I think Bale is stronger than both of them. Even in lore, Bale beat Placidusax, and I don't want to hear lore nerds going, no, but they actually had a stalemate or whatever. It's like, bro, Bale literally ripped multiple heads off. Bale wins that period, but it's not really the point. We're not talking about lore. Bale, I think, mechanically is a much more challenging fight than Placidusax, and he's more similar to Medear than anything. However, I think his moves are significantly more difficult than Medear, and he has an absolutely unreal phase 2. Phase 1's honestly manageable and not much to say there, but he has a stupidly large health pool, obviously, and the thing is with bigger enemies, and especially dragons, they typically have stronger, more devastating individual attacks, but there are usually more open punish windows for you to deal damage, even if they have a ton of health. That's not really the case in phase 2. There are moments where Bale will literally never stop swinging or putting out some kind of attack. Like, you don't really get much opportunity to even punish anything, so it feels incredibly fast-paced for a boss that's almost impossible to take down anyways because he's such a big tank. That being said, I've punched 12 holes in my wall fighting this boss, but still super fun, would highly rate him, and I'm gonna give him, I can't say he's top 5 in all of Souls, but he's pretty damn close. I think 7 is a respectable number for him, and I think he's gonna be one of the most memorable boss fights in Souls for years to come. Coming in at number 6, I'm gonna give this one to Lwig. He is the first DLC boss in Bloodborne, and my god, lads, he is insane. Just from a visual perspective, I think he's one of the most striking bosses. You cannot forget Lwig after seeing him. Just the design on this creature is like no other. Bloodborne's design and their art direction is truly unmatched, and it all comes to fruition with Lwig. He is just downright terrifying looking, like genuine nightmare fuel. And as far as the boss goes, he's quite similar to Malekith. The similarities there are actually very apparent. So obviously he fights in phase 1 as Lwig the Accursed. This is his beast form. He kind of, rushes you down. He has a lot of moves with his like mouth and jaw and runs over you. He has a couple of like projectile stuff going on, but not too much, but he's just a very fast, aggressive beast in phase 1. In phase 2, Lwig starts standing up. He gets his Moonlight greatsword, and he starts fighting you primarily with that. Malekith and Lwig are almost the exact same boss in a way, and they play equally as terrifying. Phase 2 can be pretty challenging, but it's a bit more slower paced. However, the moves hit like a train, so you really want to make sure you're not getting clipped by anything. However, this is a fair challenge for people trying to engage with the Bloodborne DLC. If you can't beat Lwig, then you're probably not prepared for the rest of the ones that are coming up. However, I think he's incredibly challenging on his own and easily one of the hardest bosses that FromSoft has ever made. All right, lads, so breaking into our top 5, this is where stuff starts to get interesting. And coming in at our number 5 spot is going to be Slave Knight Gale. This is the final boss of the final DLC of Dark Souls 3. Easily the most difficult fight in that entire game. And the reason for that is not only because the boss himself has a very challenging moveset, but he also has 3 soft phases. Like, they're not an entire phase switch up, but as the fight continues to escalate, he gets more moves, more devastating moves, and more mix-ups. So he's just going to feel tougher as you go along. The escalation of the fight is really well done, and it keeps you on your toes because moves that you thought you had figured out in phase 1 now have maybe an extra hit in phase 2 or an entirely different mix-up in phase 3. You never really feel like you're comfortable in this fight. You never really get to like learn it. I mean, you do in a way, but not very quickly. quickly and not easily. The thing is as well, not only does he have these moves that switch up throughout the fight, but he has a massive health bar. Like, you're not going to be killing him quickly with almost any build besides, like, ultra cheese ones, but every like average or regular player is gonna just be in this fight for a long time. It's one of like the longest boss fights you can probably play. And length always is a factor when determining the difficulty of a boss, but I still feel like his moveset and everything about him mechanically matches, you know, how difficult he's supposed to be. Obviously, as the final boss of the entire Souls series in a way, I would expect him to be rather difficult, and I think Slave Knight Gale really does send the game off in the correct way. One of the hardest bosses you can face, and I think easily deserves to be in the top 5. All right, coming in at number 4 is a brand new boss in the Elden Ring DLC. This is Rana Twin Moon Knight, and despite her early placement in the DLC expansion, I think she's one of the most difficult, and you may or may not agree with this, but I think she's basically a cross between Pontiff from Dark Souls 3 and Maria from Bloodborne. She essentially takes the two most difficult attributes of those fights and combines them into a single battle that has an unrelenting breakneck pace. This fight never lets up even for just a moment. It was when fighting Rana for the first time that I realized, like, damn, okay, FromSoft came to play in this one. I think a lot of people were scared that the DLC was going to be a breeze because everybody just made super overpowered characters before this came out. Rana was deliberately placed here to show that your OP build and your overconfidence from the base game is nullified here. Mods, crush the skull. Thank you. Now, as far as the boss goes, the reason I drew the comparisons to the bosses that I did is she's like Pontiff because she has two different elemental swords that she uses in tandem and has similar moves. She's also very much like Maria because she has some of the exact same animations and literal, you know, movesets from her. So it feels very similar to both of those fights and kind of just combined into one. Now, there's some new stuff, obviously. She has one fire sword and one magic sword. The fire one can make this flame tornado, and then the blue one can throw these magic slices, so you have to avoid projectiles as well as being up close and aggressive against her melee attacks. Also, her combo strings and her mix-ups almost never end. This is a criticism that I know a lot of people have of this boss. I don't know if I agree necessarily, but I can understand what people mean. She pretty much can swing like 7 to 8 times without having any opportunities to punish. Like, you never really know when it's your turn. She just keeps swinging, and especially in phase 2, she gets even more aggressive. So it can feel like an impossible task at first, but once you kind of feel the rhythm of it and you figure it out, you shouldn't have too much trouble, even though I will say that overall, she's one of the most difficult bosses FromSoft has ever made. Easily top 5, and that's why she's up here. All right, so coming in at number 3, lads, is going to be the Orphan of Cause. This is the final boss of the Bloodborne DLC, and it's easily one of the hardest bosses in all of gaming, and I know a lot of people personally who this was their FromSoftware demon. This is the one that, despite all of their efforts, this is the one they couldn't get past, and they ended up giving up on the game, and I get it, dude. He's hard as hell. Like, I feel like I take a look at Orphan of Cause, and he's so ugly that, you know what I'm saying? Like, okay, but seriously, let's talk about Orphan of Cause and why is he so hard? So not only does he have an insane health pool, he's got a lot of HP that you have to deal with. But on top of that, his moves are unbelievably powerful, and he does not stop swinging. He has multi-hit combos that are fast. They have giant wide hitboxes. He can kind of throw his placenta around a little bit as well. Yes, that's what that is. It's gross as hell, I know, but you know, that's Bloodborne. I mean, I don't really know what he was cooking, but we love Bloodborne, you know what I'm saying? He's hard enough in phase 1 because typically getting hit by one move will often lead into a combo that will just finish you off, and in phase 2, he becomes wildly unpredictable and very mobile. You know, in Bloodborne, a lot of the enemies are locked down, they're in front of you, and they're at least mostly at ground level. At least a lot of the time. There's a couple exceptions, but he goes into the air a lot in phase 2, and that's pretty hard to deal with. Now, opposed to something like Maria, like obviously she's fast and aggressive and powerful too. She doesn't have as much health, but the thing that makes Orphan of Cause a lot trickier is his parry windows are not as easily accessible. You can parry Orphan of Cause. Most of his moves are parryable, but the windows are incredibly small. Like, where you should only be relying on parries if you're absolutely certain or if you're in desperate need of some health or something, because otherwise they're very tough to land. And, you know, going for a parry in a situation where you probably should have dodged can end up in just you dying and having to completely reset. Orphan of Cause is an absolute absolute demon. There is literally no arguing that, and this list would be absolutely foul if I didn't at least include him in the top 3. He is more than well deserving of that spot, and honestly, if you ask many people, there'd probably be some that would put him at number 1, but we've still got 2 more to go. So with that being said, coming in at the number 2 spot is going to be maybe one that you thought of, and this is Melenia, Blade of Miquella. Melenia is obviously an optional boss in the base game of Elden Ring, but she essentially became the face of the game because of her difficulty. Now, the thing is, like, she just looks like a regular sword opponent, basically, but there are 2 factors that fundamentally make her ridiculous. The first one is a move she has called Waterfowl Dance. Like, obviously, this is iconic. Everybody knows about this. This move is basically an insta-kill. There are ways to dodge it, but if you don't perfect the way to avoid this, you are always dying no matter what if you get hit by this. And to make matters worse, if this insta-kill move wasn't enough that she does twice in her first phase usually, she can also get health back upon every hit received. Now, here's the thing. Even if you're taking damage, obviously she's going to get health back, but if you have a shield and you're blocking her sword, you're not losing any health, but she's still getting health back. So shield builds are pretty much nullified here. You don't want to run those, and it's not worth getting hit by anything because she's going to restore all of her health back. Now, if you manage to even take down her first phase, she has phase 2, in which she still retains her, health regenerating capabilities and Waterfowl Dance, but then she also deals Scarlet Rot. She is insanely tough, and the thing is, I feel like she's borderline breaking the rules of boss fight design. It's a big gray area, and to me, at this point, we've already played Shadow of the Erdtree bosses. I've played all the DLC fights, I've played every single one, and I still feel like Melenia takes it a little too far. I've always said I felt like it would be fair if Melenia had either Waterfowl Dance or her health regeneration, but not both. That is just a little bit overkill. I think you could easily make a case for Melenia still being the hardest boss in Souls history, period. I think there's a very strong argument to be had there, but given how much Melenia just became a menace to the entire community, I think it's fair to say that overall with the general player base, there would be a lot of people that would consider her top 1 hardest boss in all of Souls history. Now, I did realize something. Before we get to our number 1 spot, I actually haven't included anything from Demon Souls, and I want to give an honorable mention to the Flame Lurker. Look, I'm gonna be honest, I don't think really any boss in Demon Souls is crazy enough to really make this list, but I did want to give an honorable mention to this game since we haven't included anything so far, and if there was going to be a boss from that game that deserved to have a spot, I feel like it's the Flame Lurker. There's a couple contenders in Demon Souls that I feel like, maybe, but once again, you have to consider the context of the game that it's in. Flame Lurker is still a pretty difficult boss. It's fast, aggressive, these insane explosion flame moves, and you also have to remember that Demon Souls has an entirely different healing system than Estus or what we're used to now with, Elden Ring and stuff like that. So all in all, there's a lot of close contenders that I considered putting in honorable mentions that maybe should deserve a spot on this list across the entire franchise, but wanted to give a special shout out to Demon Souls with the Flame Lurker. But finally, the moment you've all been waiting for, let's get to our number 1 spot. Coming in at the number 1 spot, the hardest boss in all of Souls history is going to be Promised Consort Radahn. Now, as you've seen throughout the video, typically the final boss of every DLC is absolutely insane, and I don't think we should have expected anything less for Elden Ring. This is literally the send-off of this entire game. There's no more DLC, so we would want something to be pretty damn challenging at the end. Is Promised Consort Radahn the hardest boss in all of Souls history? I would say without a shadow of a doubt, yes. Easily, absolutely. But the problem is, do they accomplish that through entirely fair means? That's debatable, and I'm not sure. I hear an argument thrown around a lot that Radahn is a little overtuned, and maybe there's something there, but I feel like my biggest problems are in phase 1. Honestly, it's not too bad. This is entirely learnable, and even though it feels, very oppressive and ridiculous at first, it's something that you can entirely download and respond to really well. Phase 2 is where things get a little bit crazy. Now, there is one move in particular, both in phase 1 and phase 2, that in my opinion breaks the rules of Souls games in Elden Ring. He does this kind of like cross slash, and the problem with this move is in order to dodge both swings, the startup comes out so fast that you need to either be in a really good position to not get hit by it, or you need to dodge it within like a 1/10 of a second, which is much faster than the average human in reaction time. It's borderline unreactable, and even if you do happen to, roll under the first one, you're almost always getting hit by the second move. Just the way that these moves are spaced out and timed, it's basically guaranteed damage. I've not seen really any consistent ways to dodge this move. Everyone gets hit by this, and I hear people go all the time, bro, just use a shield, just block it, but you realize that's not the point. The point is, it's a move that, in traditional Souls games, if you time everything right, you can basically dodge every move, and this should be no exception, but you really can't. Like, it's just, you shouldn't be forced to use a piece of equipment to deal with a singular move that, if it were timed slightly differently, you should be able to dodge and react to. I just personally think that this move kind of breaks the rules a little bit and is a bit of a gimmick. I don't like it. Another small issue, albeit very minor in comparison, is that Miquella, joins Radahn in the second phase and leaves all of these holy hitboxes every time Radahn swings his sword, which not only adds additional damage if you get hit by it in that spot, but can make the fight visually very distracting and kind of cluttery. I feel like that's been the #1 complaint that I've seen across the community in regards to phase 2, is that it's just like impossible to see what's going on. You'll sometimes just get insta-killed in phase 2 and not really know what you did wrong. I feel like a good Souls boss, you end up blaming yourself and not the game, where a lot of times I feel you end up blaming the game or the arena or, the visual clutter or whatever it is, instead of blaming the boss itself or yourself. But that's pretty much the main issue as far as I see it. Is it the hardest boss? Once again, yeah, absolutely. This easily took me the longest to complete out of any Souls boss ever, and that is the same sentiment for a lot of people I've talked to. I know FromSoftware wanted to end Elden Ring off with a bang, and yes, they accomplished it. Promised Consort Radahn did dethrone Melenia and all other Souls bosses before it as the king, but it kind of feels like a bit of a slippery slope where, you have one move in here that breaks the rules. Like, are they going to try to go even crazier next time? Like, I don't really know, but I think it's a great boss still. I just have a couple of minor problems with it, but I really do like it at the end of the day, and is easily, as far as difficulty goes, without a doubt the hardest. Like, that's not even debatable. So anyways, guys, let me know what you thought of my list. Who do you think is the hardest boss in Souls personally? And if you want to see more videos, please make sure to subscribe. I would really appreciate it. According to YouTube, only 8% of my viewers are currently subscribed. That's the 8% that beat Radahn on the first try. So if you haven't subscribed, do that right now. You'll beat him first try, guaranteed. No scam here. But anyways, guys, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace out.